Thank you, David, and thank you to the whole team here at Columbia Entrepreneurship and the Engineering School for putting this event together. And thank you to all of you for coming out and listening to this. It's hard to compete with a nice, crisp fall evening, but I appreciate the time that you're putting into learning more about how immigration pathways within the US can assist you in starting a venture here in New York City. As Dave mentioned, I work for the New York City Economic Development Corporation. This is part of the Bloomberg administration's efforts here in New York City to develop the city as a centre for entrepreneurs, large and small companies. And my particular role is to assist the city in attracting international business and talent. So that really means attracting folks like you who are already in the city to stay in the city, to build businesses, to employ people, and therefore make New York City an even better place to live. So I'm very pleased to be here with my fellow panellists. Today, as I said, we're focusing on pathways available under existing immigration law for international students who would like to continue to stay here in the US and perhaps start your own company. We have two Columbia alums here who are actually either going through that process or have been through that process, Kajal and Jean. And we have Dan Berger, an immigration attorney, who can also advise you on the issues that you're going to face. In terms of the format, Jean, Kajal and I will sort of speak briefly about some of our experiences. We'll launch into a panel discussion, including Dan, that I will moderate. And at the end of the evening, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions as well that you may have. To end the entire discussion, we'll actually have a little bit of a networking event, I believe, where you can sort of talk to us one-on-one. So enough on that. I'd like to start off actually with Jean. Jean Meyer is the founder, a co-founder of DateMySchool and a Columbia Business School alum, originally from France. Do you want to take us away, Jean, about your story and your immigration experience in particular?
Sure. Can you hear me well? It's good? Okay, so as you can hear, I'm French, from France. Got my engineering degree very close from Paris, actually. And the truth is, right after my degree, I got this great job at BNP Paribas, which is a big bank in Philadelphia. So very seamless process, right? I mean, you apply for a visa, they give you one. It was back in 2007. Very easy, worked there for 2 years. And then the economic crisis. So I had to go back to France and work on my own startup. So I started something, first entrepreneurship experience, really cool, loved it. But I loved the US, I love this country, and I wanted actually to start something here. We hire and we create 10 jobs in this country. And we almost got kicked out, got deported at the end of our PT. And I think the backup plan was basically to go back to school and to get a PhD in something from some school and try to manage the business on the side. But that was our only option there.
Okay, and Kajal, do you want to add anything from that, a little bit about your experience so far? I know that you're going through this process a little bit different to Jean.
Yeah, so I graduated from the business school last year. I'm from London, and I started two ventures. I mean, from the point where I was in school, where I knew I wanted to start my own venture, it took me 6 months just to navigate the information out there. It was so difficult to understand what would be the best option for me. And I went, talked to several lawyers, and at the end of every conversation, they were like, this is really complex. How about you get married? So I was like, well, that's not a backup plan, and that's actually a very difficult thing to do. So I ended up deciding on the E2 visa, and the reason I went for that is because it's a treaty with specific countries. So there's a trader treaty with the UK, and by the time that I was actually applying, I was already operational. I had revenue coming in, I had customers, I'd been hiring contractors, so I thought I had a pretty solid case. As Jean described, I mean, I think he said the paperwork was here. The E2, I would argue, is up here. So that was a fun job for nights and weekends, from the beginning of this year. The E2 was actually approved in the US, so if I never left the country, I'd be fine. So when my OPT expired, I needed to be in status. So the E2 visa allowed me to continue to run my business, but in order for me to travel, I have to go back to the US Embassy in London, have an interview on my visa there, and then get the stamp, and then I'm allowed to travel. So it's been a long process, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It was a real pain in the ass. But if you have a venture that you really believe in, I really think it's worth going through. I mean, if you plan carefully enough while you're a student, it is possible to stay here. It's complicated, but if you get the right lawyer, if you get the right people advising you, you can do it. And the E2 specifically, I'll just say 1 or 2 points on that. I wasn't going for VC funding, so I self-funded half, and I had a strategic investor from London. And the investment just has to be proportional to the business that you're running. So that's one big criteria. The other thing is they want to see that you're going to create jobs and opportunities in the US. So you have to show that this isn't just like a shell company and you're just doing it to get a visa. So you have to show committed funds so that you have things at risk, so you're not just going to get up and leave the country. And then I think the last thing, which is good for all of you guys, is that you have to be qualified as an owner of the business. So you're all, STEM graduates. You'll get, I think, 1.5 years after you graduate. That's going to stand in your favor. And I think, hopefully, I'll let you know once I have the interview, but Columbia puts you in a better position in that sense. And I guess, from a final point of view of going through this process, it made me so angry. And I started, looking more into the immigration reform process. And, some of you must have read about the bill in the news. And there's actually a lot you can all do as individual students to help change that. You can call Congress up, you can raise the issue, and most importantly, complain to anyone you can complain to, because we need people who actually have citizenship and passports to understand the process that you have to go through to actually stay in the country. So, I complained to everyone I could for the last year, and it just raises the awareness of the topic. So I would really encourage you, any of you who are thinking about this process, one, to not give up and actually do it, because a lot of people would ask me about it and would be deterred by the process. But if you have a business you really want to start, I would really encourage you to go through it. And the second thing is to do something about actually changing it.
Thanks, Kajal. Just to add to that, in my role at the Economic Development Corporation, I come in contact with international entrepreneurs on a daily basis. So I talk to folks from around the world who are trying to start businesses or grow businesses here in New York City, and our job is try to make that a little bit easier. Immigration continues to be a challenge, as both our panelists have already talked about, but I do want you to take the message away that actually as an international student, you have a little bit of a runway here that is not open to many people. So you're here as students. I think both our panelists mentioned you have access to OPT, optional practical training. When you conclude your degree, if you are a STEM graduate in science or a technical field, you may have a longer period on OPT, which you can use to grow your business. And I'm sure Dan will be able to touch on the options that are available after your OPT if you want to convert that into a longer stay in the US. But just a little bit about why I'm here representing the city. International entrepreneurship is hugely important to the city. So over 40% of the workforce in New York City is actually foreign born. Around 25 to 30% of engineering and technology companies that are formed in New York have at least one immigrant founder. New York City has always been a city of immigrants. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm also an immigrant and have a personal interest in this. The largest proportion of international founders, so those who come to the US and start companies, they actually came to the US on a student visa. So you sitting here by virtue of being at Columbia, most of you will probably be on a student visa, you really have a head start, and you are the most fertile source of entrepreneurs for the city. So we really want to do what we can to assist you in starting businesses here. As I said, I think the message is that it is possible. It's not easy, but it is possible to navigate these pathways. And I also want you to understand that New York City is a great place to launch a company. So as Jean said, you know, you have access to a market of 350 million people, but specifically here in New York City, it is you know, the undisputed leader in media, in advertising, in fashion, in financial services. If you have an idea for a company that touches on any of these industries, then it makes sense for you to try to start that here in New York. And I think that, you know, if you look at the news, there's been tremendous growth in the entrepreneurial scene here in New York. You know, companies like Tumblr, etc., Guild Group have all started and grown here in New York. And they've actually been very impressive companies that have been started from international founders here in New York. Some of you may have used the service ZocDoc, which is sort of an online platform that allows you to find a doctor easily that matches with your insurance. That has a international co-founder. The company Street Easy, which helps you find sort of real estate options here in New York, also a co-founder from Venezuela in that case. So there's plenty of examples here of international businesses like the two that you have represented here and others that are doing well in New York. The final thought I want to leave you with before we sort of engage in a discussion is that by virtue of being here at Columbia, you actually have access to some great programs that will set you on the path to starting your own business. So a couple of examples. One is the Fast Pitch competition, which is on October 30, which is open to students at the engineering school and beyond. And Ivy, who's sitting at the back, can give more details on that, and there are flyers available at the front. I also want to mention the NYC Next Idea competition, which is a competition that actually is jointly run by my organisation and Columbia University. This is a global new venture competition where we invite teams from all around the world to submit their business ideas for New York. The winning team gets $35,000 in prize money, they get office space, they get mentorship. It's no strings attached, and we've seen winners of this competition from around the world actually go on to build great companies here in New York. So that competition is also open for entries. I encourage you to talk to me or get a flyer afterwards. So with that in mind, I'd like to just sort of ask a couple of questions of the panelists, including Dan, and then I'll invite some Q&A from the audience. Dan, I guess to bring you in, we heard about the H-1B pathway, we heard about the E2 pathway for certain countries. We heard about getting married to an American as well. What are the visa options that are really available to folks here in the room, being students and wanting to start businesses here?
The visa, the H-1B and the E2 are both very common options. Immigration, as you've probably figured out by now, is a game of categories. So there are many, many categories of temporary visas and a few categories of permanent residence. And I think that the best way to work with entrepreneurs who don't always fit into a category, they're often multinational, sometimes holding multiple passports, sometimes companies are founded by people from different countries with different disciplines and with different backgrounds. Our strategy is to start by looking at all the categories. And that could include, you know, if someone is married to a foreign national, some visas allow spouses unlimited work authorization. If someone is a foreign student, an F1 student, there is that OPT, the student work authorization that you can get after you graduate. H-1Bs, depending on how the company is structured, you found, can be used for key employees or even owners if the company is structured correctly. The E2 visa is appropriate if the United States has a treaty with a specific treaty with your country of citizenship. Some other options I'll just mention quickly, although there are others. There is a visa called an L visa. Most of the visas with letters are temporary visas. The L visa is for someone who works abroad for, and I know you'd mentioned that you were on one, someone who works abroad for a year and then is transferred back to the US, either to start a new office or to work for an affiliate. So sometimes the answer to the visa situation is to build up a company abroad and then expand it in the United States. Some of you, I know, especially with engineers and postdocs, there may be an opportunity for an O1 visa, which is a visa for someone who is extraordinary in his or her field. These just like the E2 visas. These are, I know, sometimes difficult for the individuals, but fun for us because we get to be creative about marketing you, or marketing your business, or marketing what you've done. And an O1 visa for an engineer, for example, could involve marketing the publications and the research or the patents that somebody has done and where they stand in their field. And even at the postdoc level, it is, and sometimes at the graduate student level, it is possible to make that argument. It also can work in the business world. Arguing that somebody is extraordinary in the business world takes even more creativity, because you don't have the same kind of metrics as you do in engineering, where you can look at citations and publications and so forth. And the last thing is we do look quickly at what we call green card or permanent residence options. So obviously family could be an option. There is a diversity visa lottery which opens up October 1st for those of you who are, and there's a list online of what countries can apply. Any country that has sent more than 5% of the immigrants last year, if you're born in a country that sent more than 5% of the immigrants last year, you cannot apply because it is a diversity lottery. But that does include many, 180 countries in the world are still on the list. So unfortunately, if you're from India, China, Nigeria, El Salvador, Mexico, some of the main sending countries, if you're born in those countries, you can't apply. But I would encourage those of you who might be eligible to check the government website or check our website and consider applying in October. It's free and easy, and don't let anybody charge you to do that. And there are other types of green card options that may be available for investment or other purposes.
Can I ask a question? When you start a business, and this is for all of you, often you have a partner, and it's not just something that you're doing on your own. Although, Kajal, you sort of doing?
My partner's in London.
Is in London. So I wanted to ask, how you found the process of having a business partner. Has that assisted this? Has it made it more complicated? And how have you sort of approached the issue of immigration? Has it?
So my partner's name is Balazs Alexa from Hungary. So obviously we were in the same boat and struggling a little bit together. It was though kind of different in the sense that I was transferring my H1B from another big corporation called Elsevier, and he was getting sponsored from scratch by DateMySchool. It was really helpful actually at the end of the day, because feeling that we are all in the same boat and all in the same shit together, we know that either we make it happen or we die together. And just this feeling, of thinking that it's all in or it's nobody, make it. Psychologically, we're talking about this, right? You are a little bit nervous about the visa process. That made me feel more cool about it. Like I was like, okay, anyway, at the end of the day, if this doesn't work, my business partner will always find a solution to make this work. And because we were together in this, and because you have investors backing you as well, you have this feeling that your investors and your VCs cannot let you down, right? They will pull any trigger, any network, actually, to make you stay in this country. So yeah, to answer the question, that helped a lot. And if I can just build on what you said before, and I really want to build on that about New York as a great place for entrepreneur. If some of you are thinking about starting a tech business and are thinking about the Silicon Valley, don't go. Don't go for, I have 1 gazillion of reasons to tell you to not go and stay in New York. And maybe, besides funding, obviously, maybe one of the most important one is PR. When you start a business, right, you need PR. You need to be there. You need to be out there. And in New York, we started this dating site, right? DateMySchool. We got the New York Times. We got CNN. We got the biggest publication here just because we were in New York City and because I knew this New York Times reporter and I could talk to her directly because we were there on Columbia campus. With how many startups do you compete with in Stanford or in Berkeley? I mean, you're one among millions, right? And here you're almost alone because you don't have that many competition. That's one reason. And the second reason is to hire people. I mean, you're competing with Google and Facebook in the Valley. Here, it's so much easier to get the best talent to work for your startup. And that's the two main reasons why we wanted to stay in New York, even though the VC wanted us to move to the Valley. We were like, no, we want to stay in New York for these two reasons, and that's, I think, what made us successful at the end of the day.
How have you found the experience of having someone in London?
Well, I think the perspective, I wanted to just talk about it from the lab perspective. So we had 24 businesses last year that graduated from the business school. 4 of us were foreign. So 2 actually, unfortunately, ended up going back. And the 2 surviving ones, we have a kind of a small group therapy session every once in a while because it's a really uncertain process. Not knowing where you're going to live can be a really difficult thing to go through. So as much as you can educate yourself, it makes a difference. And I think having that network, having the Columbia network around to actually, you know, if one of them spoke to a lawyer or I'd spoken to someone that gave me some insight into how to make this process easier, that was a huge help. In terms of my partner's actually my brother. He just had to listen to me complain. I mean, aside from that, he wasn't really involved in the process. But the foreign business owners from Columbia just proved to be a really good network to stay in touch with through the process.
Thanks. Dan, do you want to add anything? Is it advantageous at all to have a local partner?
It can be. I think, you know, that brings up a little bit of a more general point that people often come to us and say, well, what is the best way to structure a business for visa purposes? And I can see how tempting that is when I hear the challenges that people have. I really try to turn that around when people come to us and have them tell me what would be best for business purposes. You tell me, is it good to have it for business purposes, tax purposes, collaboration purposes? Is it best to have a small office here? Is it best to have a business partner abroad? And then we try to work on the visa, because if the business doesn't take off, then the visa will not be renewable, or the visa will be harder to renew. So I think we've had success with both solo businesses and partners, and I think the key is really coming up with an idea that has a good chance of working, and then structuring it, changing the structure as little as possible to meet one of the visa categories, and then selling that to the American government.
And I guess putting yourself in the shoes of folks in this room, who are the key professionals that you need to be in touch with when you're thinking about this? And at what stage should you start engaging a lawyer or an accountant, etc.? I think a great place to start, and actually I think Matt Roy is going to be introduced later, would be a business planner, because I think it's helpful to have early on at least a discussion with an immigration professional and with someone who has business knowledge. And Matt, for example, is someone we've worked with for years who has a business helping entrepreneurs and engineers and so forth think about how to structure a business from a business perspective so that it will match the immigration rules. So I think having an entrepreneur type business planner is very important, because talking to somebody about the visa options is very important.
And then tax is obviously, unfortunately, a reality of life. And Kajal and I were just talking earlier about how difficult it is to find somebody who understands the international tax issues. In the past, we used to default to having people use an accountant here, an accountant in their home country, and try to get them to talk to each other. That's obviously not ideal. Increasingly, there are some good people, and I think the Columbia Network can help you find that, and we can help you try to touch base with those people, somebody who can help you understand the best way to structure things tax-wise.
Maybe two more questions from me, and then I'll open it up to the audience. And if you do have questions after these two, then I invite you to sort of start lining up behind the microphone over here so that we can capture the question. But first, a question for you, Jean. I know that you've sort of employed 10 people that you mentioned here in New York. Have many of those been also immigrants or from other countries, and how has that process been? Have you had difficulties at all in getting the folks that you want?
So here's the thing. We had two difficulties here. The first one was actually with the nature of the business. We are a dating site, and when we had this application, when we made this application for the Immigration Bureau, we didn't want to say we are a dating site, because in terms of perception, we always imagine, you know, this lady behind her desk looking at her applications like, huh, dating site, really? And so we call ourselves a reverse social network, because for some reason we had the impression that's going to be like a very bad perception, and we'll have less chance to get through the process. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, but we really had this perception at the end of the day. And to answer your question more directly, we have so 10 people now, and only 3 American people. We have people from Brazil, from India, from France, obviously from Hungary. And the thing is, we realized it was actually very hard to find great talent in this country, especially on the engineering side. So we tried to hire very good engineers, and actually interviewed more than 40 of them from the best school in the country. Obviously Columbia, but also MIT, Harvard, Berkeley, Stanford. And you know what? All the people who actually interviewed for my company were not very good. Were actually kind of very bad, because all the good ones went already for Google, Facebook, etc. And we had only the people who couldn't get another job. So we changed strategy, and we decided to hire people from other countries. So we went to France, directly out of school, and we tell them, look guys, we offer you a job in New York City, United States of America, right? And with a great salary compared to what you can get in France, and we sponsor your visa and everything you need. What do you say? And we got the best of the best. We got the cream of the cream. So very young engineer, very junior, not that expensive compared to a salary in the US, and willing to come here for the experience and to be in New York City. So yeah, that's why we have so many people from other countries like Brazil, France, Hungary, etc., because we have no other choice. And actually, if I can build up on that, if any of you here wants to get their visa sponsored, all right, and a job in a very cool and flexible company, we have an indoor soccer field and ping pong tables, okay, and you can code in iOS or Java. Just come to me after the Q&A.
Great. I'd like to ask a question about, future directions in immigration, and I think both Dan and Kajal talked about immigration reform. Dan, if I could start with you, what is the current situation with immigration reform? Many of the people here would have heard about the proposals. What's the current status, what's on the table, and what are the prospects for where it goes from here?
I think I'll answer that just quickly because we want to get to Q&A, but in 2 parts, if I could. I will say, before we talk about Congress, which is a different story, I'd like to just say something nice about the Immigration Service, and please forgive me. But in many ways, they are trying, and they are limited by the categories that Congress has given them. We have seen in the past 4 or 5 years that the Immigration Service really has made an effort to be more welcoming to entrepreneurs. They still can't change the categories that these old categories, most of them come from 1990 and before, that don't fit the modern world. They certainly don't fit the tech or the internet world. But if you Google U.S. Immigration Service and entrepreneurship, you will see a real effort. They have actually hired entrepreneurs and business people in residence to come in, work with their staff, be some of the people who are actually reviewing these E-2 visas, which is much better than the type of person you were imagining who was sitting behind the desk. And that has improved the quality of decisions. So I think we're moving, we're seeing some momentum. We can't really go much further without Congress, that they need to create new categories. And that's the next step. At the moment, this is all wrapped up in the big immigration bill that you may or may not have been hearing about on the news, that has everything, including a path to citizenship for millions of undocumented workers and many other things. The pieces about entrepreneur visas that are in there are really quite good. And if this big bill passes, and most people think that it will either happen or not happen late this year or early next year because of the congressional election cycle. I think once we get into a congressional election next year, if we don't have a new immigration law, we probably won't get it for many years. So the kind of efforts you're making to call it are good. It's possible. We were involved a little bit in trying to comment on the language of these bills, and one of the things that we try to do is say, instead of having a formula for what an entrepreneur should look like, we try to turn it around and look at who is backing that entrepreneur. So for example, if somebody has been successful in raising venture capital, if somebody has found angel investors, if somebody has been able to get a patent or has support, direct written support from an economic development council in a town or a city or a chamber of commerce, that should be a very big factor, because those people know best what's good for the American economy. I hope that happens. I really do encourage all of you to do what Kajal was talking about and tell people. I mean, you don't necessarily have to complain, but you can try to get out there. You know, I come from liberal Massachusetts. Our late Senator Kennedy, his office was getting calls, apparently 5 to 1 a few years ago, against new business visas, against H-1B visas, and I think it's because people who, the small percent of Americans who are anti-immigrant, are much more vocal. They just write a lot more letters, they make a lot more calls. So if you are not an American citizen, you can't vote, but you can contact Congress and you can try to get your name out there, and you can tell your friends to do that. So.
Thanks. And Kajal, I'll ask you the last question before we throw to the audience. I know that you've mentioned the labs, and you know that there is space that is available to students from the business school and the engineering school. Could you talk a little bit about how the students here may be able to take advantage of that as they graduate and think about where to go from here?
Yeah, I don't know if Chris, maybe you want to touch on that from the engineering point of view, but we, so the lab essentially was started by a group of entrepreneurs. So it was myself and a couple of others who went through the entrepreneurship curriculum at Columbia. We, you know, our alternative if we didn't have the lab was working out Starbucks. So we grouped together and we launched last June. So we started with 30 seats, 24 ventures, and it provides a lot of benefits just beyond the co-working space. So we essentially wanted to extend all of the resources that we had at school. So this was things like legal services, accounting, you know, discounts on Amazon Web Services. That there was a couple of things that made sense for a group of entrepreneurs from Columbia to have. So we've now since agreed to expand that to the engineering school, so there will be some seats open. So I definitely encourage you to come down and visit. We're in Soho. You know, certainly if you have any questions, not just on immigration, but setting up the businesses in New York and what the lab can provide, I'd encourage you to come down and speak to us about that.
Thanks very much. At this stage, I'd like to invite anyone who has a question. You can certainly come up and ask that. You know, we have the panelists here, and also Matt Roy will be available after this session as well to answer any questions you may have individually.
Hey, so it seems like both of you guys kind of started the company while you were at school. At least you kind of, you know, got into the initial process. Now, that's obviously a really smart thing to do. The issue I'm currently facing is that I've just started in July, so for the first 2 quarters, I can't work anywhere for compensation. So I was reading around the web, and I'm kind of wondering, can you actually incorporate a company and work for your own company, even if it doesn't make all that much money under that immigration status? Because otherwise, I can't partner up with anyone either, because you know you can sign up any equity share agreements or whatever if you can incorporate the company.
Okay. Well, I mean, in our case, we haven't waited any semester or anything. We didn't even think about it. We incorporated in Delaware as soon as we could. So they didn't ask us for like any immigration paperwork or anything, and maybe we were illegal, but I don't know. We just created an LLC, and it worked out, and we got our partnership set up, and no, we didn't think too much about it. Maybe it was the wrong thing to do. I don't know.
That's fine, and obviously there's a fine line between incorporating and being a passive owner of a company and actually working for the company and making money, and that's the dividing line, and that's where so a lot of the initial work in setting up a company and thinking about it and incorporating can be done while you're a student, but if you actually start operating and start paying yourself or making money from the work that you've done, that's where you need to have work authorization, and that line is sometimes a little difficult to see. We do have a basic Q&A website that explains that, and I can share it with Dave or Chris, and they can perhaps send it around, but it is, I think you're asking the right question, and I think if you plan it out during the course of your student visa, usually this can work quite well.
Hello. So one of the main concerns for an entrepreneur is how to hire international students and sponsor H-1B for them. So I have 2 questions. The first one is, can you explain the steps and fires that are needed to sponsor H-1B for a startup, for students who want to work for a startup? The second question is, how long does it take for a Chinese student to get one H-1B who wants to work for a startup? Thank you.
I could just, have you actually hired sponsored H-1B?
So I don't know if it's different for China or for different countries. No. So first thing, what we do, we don't sponsor them with an H-1B. We don't do that. You have tons of different organisms that can sponsor actually a J-1 visa for students, and they can work as an intern here in this country. And it seems to us that it was the best solution. Like you have you can get a J-1 for a year, so you can work with this person for a year at a very good salary for an intern and see if they fit into your company. And if they do, arrive in April, you can start the application for H-1B.
Okay, and just to clarify that J-1, a J-1 is a trainee visa, so it's good for up to 18 months. If this is something you're interested in, you can. They're usually sponsored by various nonprofits. One really good one is the American Immigration Council. So if you Google American Immigration Council, I think you'll see a tab up there that says International Exchange Center. Please keep in mind, and I just have to sound like a lawyer here, I'm sorry, two things about the J1. Number one is that the intention of a J1 really should be training. If you make a J1 application and you say, and anybody says up front that the goal of this is to try to recruit long-term workers, the visa will be denied. So the point of the J1 visa is for somebody to come for training, and just like a student visa, it's a little bit of a don't ask, don't tell situation where if you your plan, you do not want to discuss your long-term plans necessarily, and many of you are young, you may not know exactly what your long-term plans are. But the J1 is a temporary 18-month visa. It is also not available anymore to people who have gone to school in the U.S. So I imagine when you were recruiting in France, the J1 visa is a wonderful tool. But if you're recruiting Columbia graduates, the J1 visa is no longer available to you. The H-1B used to be a bread and butter visa for us, and in some ways still is, but it's basically for any job that requires at least a bachelor's degree in a particular field. For engineers, that's really pretty easy. You have somebody with an engineering degree doing engineering. Once you start to get into some more creative companies, like in Kajal's case, what kind of skills does it take to run a business? Does it really require a bachelor's in business to run her business? The Immigration Service may have some more questions. The biggest challenge with the H-1B for biggest challenges for H-1Bs for startups are salary. The H-1B requires that a regular salary be paid. Not all startups can do that. It can be part-time though, which may be one way around this. The H-1B also does involve now increasingly site visits from the Immigration Service. If you're operating out of your garage, or I guess in New York City it would be your loft or your front room, those site visits, your company may not look quite as real as it is as an internet presence, and there is a quota, as people mentioned, and I'm not sure. I'll just throw this out quickly because I think this is an audience that may be receptive to this. There is no H-1B quota for universities, nonprofits, or nonprofits that are affiliated with universities. So one idea that we had discussed with some other business schools, and I'm throwing this out there, is perhaps to have incubator spaces where people can start off, and let's say if you are working on if you do start off on the Columbia campus, or if some of the incubator space in Soho is actually considered Columbia property, it may be possible to, in good faith, avoid some of the H-1B quotas when you're starting off. That would involve some thinking ahead, but it may be a possibility.
And just to add to that, if you're thinking of working for a startup, I think from a practical point of view, I have friends who were going through the same route. Just make it as easy as possible for them to hire you. So if you offer to pay the legal fees, if you put the whole case together, if you educate yourself on the process and you take all the hard work out of it, it becomes, you have a much better chance of being hired.
My question's around the fundraising process and how that's impacted by the visa issues. So it sounds like with DateMySchool, you'd already raised the money before you had the visas sorted. I'm just interested how that impacted on the decision of your investors. Was that investment at all conditional on the fact that you were able to stay in the country? And in general, whether getting an H-1B visa for a business is possible without actually having raised professional money?
We got, yes, almost $3 million before actually getting our H-1B with our OPT. we talked to several investors. Some were foreigners, some were like typical VC from the Valley. And we got our first seed money from Artiman Venture Capital for like $500,000 in the Valley. And it's funny because like most of the partners at Artiman are Indians and are coming from India too. And either them or the other VCs we talked to or the strategic investors we had later didn't care at all about our visa stature. They cared more about the business per se. They care more about like the operations. Are we going to go bankrupt? Are we going to fail? How are we going to make money? The visas were like, this is a detail for us. We have connection, we have network. We know the biggest like immigration firm in the country. We are not afraid at all, and there will always be a solution. I mean, you know what an entrepreneur is, right? Someone who finds solution all the time. So that doesn't matter. And as I mentioned before, worst case scenario, we are going to do like a PhD on the side or anything to stay in the country. Now, the second part of your question, I don't know, and I'm sure like other people might have like better insight about this. But one thing is for sure that putting in our application file that was that big again, that we just got like an investment of $2.5 million, I think made us like feel extremely legit. That plus they ask you as well to take picture of your office. So we had to take picture of our office, of the people like faking work, you know, on the desk to make it feel like a real legit company. So that plus the money, yes, helped a lot to make DateMySchool able to actually sponsor visas. But
and I think you bring up a good point. I think your question was, do you need money before you sponsor an H-1B? And I think no, but technically. But on the other hand, the H-1B does involve promises that are actually made to Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Labor that that the company will pay the employee a certain salary regularly, even if you don't have work for them. And that's a difficult promise to make if you don't have some money coming in already. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg issue. So keeping an employee on that OPT as long as possible before committing to the H-1B may be one option.
I think I had two conflicting pieces of advice when I first started the process. So one lawyer actually told me to just apply on a business plan, so without having the company operational and hiring, etc. And I think actually in the end it was an advantage to have everything up and running, to have press, to have invoices to show customers and contractors I was hiring. So I think that actually made my case stronger. But what you do have to consider is, you know, the time frame of uncertainty around this, because it is somewhat of a catch-22, because to even be eligible, you have to have significant investment or invest a certain amount. But if you then get kicked out of the country, that can become sunk costs. So I think you have to balance that really carefully. In hindsight, I would say, you know, if you have something operational, if you have some good traction after 6 months, that's a good point to apply. But Dan might have another opinion on that.
No, I think that's a great point. One quick point that sounds really obvious, but I think it's a quick warning. Be aware of your internet presence, because I've seen the Immigration Service usually does not look beyond the file you send them, which is why it has to be well documented if you want to win. But they will Google. They don't have to stand up to do that. They can just Google you. And if they find, and sometimes they find things that don't look good. So for example, if they're sitting there looking at your E2 application and they Google you and they see that you're already listed as the CEO of a company, and you're doing that for marketing purposes, there may be questions about whether you're working without authorization. So we Google everybody before we file anything or send them to an immigration interview or send them across a border, because I want to know what the Immigration Service might see and how it might be perceived.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for responding to that funding question. I had the exact same question. It was very good news, actually, to know that you got the money and they don't really care. So I'm gonna actually do a question for Dan, and I've heard that basically both Democrats and Republicans agree in the entrepreneurship immigrants part of the bill, and how likely do you believe it is that eventually we're gonna separate the bill in terms of just approving the part of the entrepreneurship, international students, and the other part? Because the way I heard about it is that they disagree much more in more general ways of international workers, and everybody agrees that international entrepreneurs should. So how likely do you feel it's possible?
You know, trying to predict what Congress will do is a challenge. So for what it's worth, I think this will happen at some point. It's logical. I mentioned the main immigration categories, but to go back to 1990 and before, we have a very different economy now. For example, what they call the $1 Million Green Card, which involves an investment for trying to go directly to permanent residence. $1 million is very different now than it was in 1990, and the way it's structured is different. The Senate bill is a comprehensive bill. The House has already divided that up into 4 different sections, one of which is about business, and the rest is about undocumented workers and border security and so forth. So I'm cautiously optimistic that something will happen, but hard to say.
Hi. So let me tell you about my background. So I graduated in December, and I've been working on a startup part-time and with 2 other co-founders who are Americans. And I'm working at Columbia research lab here. Finally, I'm actually contemplating on joining them full-time because we have funding. We have like seed funding about 200,000. So I just want to know, since we're just 3 people and we're a small company, like how easy it would be for me to move from here to there as full-time, and in future, like next April applying for H-1B, how difficult it would be to do that?
I think it would be possible to move to the H-1B even with a very small company. I think before you decide that that's the right thing to do, I think I would suggest taking a step back and looking at the whole range of visa options, including perhaps self-petition, permanent residence, and other types of things, just to make sure that the H-1B is really the right option. And if it is very possible for a small company to sponsor an H-1B. It takes a little bit more work, but it can be done.
First of all, thank you very much for taking your time and making this happen. And my question addressed to Dan. I'm wondering, like, because I'm currently on student visa, and if my visa, if I have like another H-1B visa sponsored by another company, because I know those are all non-immigration visas, if I start my own company, like, could I be the founder of the company? Will that affect my immigration status?
You know, that's, again, as a lawyer, I have to be careful how I respond to things. But the basic answer is, and I will send the website to Dave and Chris, and maybe you can share it, because we have a Q&A that we've developed for students, a very common question. Basically, you can own a company. People own, you know, parts of Manhattan who live in other parts of the world, and people own companies who live elsewhere. Once you start making money and getting paid, you do need some kind of work authorization, and so that's really the dividing line. Okay, is that?
Giving myself, like, sponsor myself. I can be like sponsored by someone else, and then just could I, like, meanwhile, create a company and then make money as a foreigner?
Well, you know, I think here's the distinction. Creating a company and being a passive owner is almost like buying a share of General Motors stock. You can do that. You can own a company, but whether you call yourself an employee or not, if you are doing work to make the company make money, and then that money is going into your pocket, you're working. And in the past, before the internet, sometimes this would happen under the radar. But increasingly, if you have a company, it has a web presence and it will be seen. And so before you start having money coming in and going into your pocket, you really should be thinking about work authorization.
All right. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to sort of wrap up the panel part of the discussion. Thank you, Kajal, Jean, and Dan for your time. I'd also like to introduce Matt Roy, who's here from the New Atlantic Management Group, if I've got that right. Matt, as Dan mentioned, will be here for the rest of the evening to sort of talk one-on-one with people and can give some advice on immigration, but also, you know, setting up a business and the steps that you need to be thinking through. So once again, thank you all for being here. It's been our pleasure, and feel free to come and approach us with any questions you may have.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but if I could, just to give a little perspective, Matt, and I'm not being paid to do this, Matt is not only an MBA, but has also been a U.S. consular officer who spent 3 years making decisions on E2 visas, so he has a very interesting perspective on this. And Megan Clute is one of our attorneys who's sitting in front of him, and so she's also available. I mean, available to answer questions.
And thank you. Thank you all for your time on that, Matt.